So as many of you know, some of you know, I've just recently come back from 4 months supporting the course at Kukuloka, which I enjoyed very, very much indeed. One of the things I did whilst I was there, and one of the things I decided to do, was to study Bhante more and to read Bhante more. Particularly, I was reading the memoirs, I was rereading some of the seminars, I was reading some of the letters, and rereading some of the talks he's given over the years. So really this talk comes out of, almost exclusively out of my recent reading. And when I was reading the memoirs in particular, and I'm sure you've all experienced this, is you get this feeling, don't you, that Bhante is doing one thing. All the time, he's doing one thing. Whether he's taking some Tibetan brothers to Darjeeling to go and see a steam train for the first time, whether he's ordering a pizza in Florence, whether he's meditating, whether he's studying, whether he's seeing these rather unusual middle-aged ladies in Kalimpong, he's just doing one thing all the time. And you feel that as you read the memoirs more and more strongly, and yet that one thing is very, very subtle, so you can never quite focus on it. But as I read it, I felt that more and more, that there was just one thing that Bhante was doing. And you could say that one thing is going for refuge to the Three Jewels, or practicing the Dharma, and that probably would be the most adequate sort of label to put on that one thing. If you had to say what that one thing was, going for refuge to the Three Jewels or practicing the Dharma is the least confusing way of putting it. But it doesn't really quite do it. It doesn't really quite communicate it. It doesn't for me, and I don't think it probably would for him even. I'm tempted to say that Bhante is just living, capital letters. He's just living. He's living in the best possible way, in the best possible sense. And that's the one thing he's doing. And he doesn't make much distinction whether that's meditating or studying or talking to people or walking up and down the path outside the hermitage. He's just living. It's as if this one thing he's doing is too big to talk about. It's too big to write about. You can feel it if you read the memoirs attentively, but you can't address it directly. There's just one thing. As if there's just life. That for Bhante there's just life. And that life is intrinsically resonant, intrinsically meaningful, intrinsically mysterious. And he's in that life all the time and writing from that life all the time. So it felt to me reading it that he's just doing one thing. But when I was reading Facing Mount Kachinjunga, a particular passage jumped out to me which I really want to base my whole talk on. I think this is one way of getting a bit closer to the one thing that Bhante has been doing all this time, and the one thing that he's encouraging us to do in our Dharma lives. If you want to look it up, it's on page 347 of Facing Mount Kachinjunga, and it's sandwiched between a description of people walking down the road that you can see from his typewriter in the hermitage, and a description of some drunken neighbours. So it's not the end of a chapter, it's not a big moment in the chapter, it's just sandwiched between two other descriptions. And he's talking about walking up and down the path outside the hermitage, between the hermitage itself and the little shrine room. And he says, as I slowly walked up and down the path, which sometimes was bordered with shocking pink zinnias and bright orange marigolds, I nearly always experienced a deep sense of peace and harmony, of fulfillment and well-being. It was as though the trees were my silent companions who could share my thoughts and feelings, and from whose tranquil presence I derived nourishment and inspiration. Indeed, as I walked up and down in their leafy neighbourhood, sentences of articles and stanzas of poems would come unbidden to my mind, as well as feelings and insights for which as yet I had no words. When that happened, I would experience an intense joy. The flowers above my head and at my feet would shine with an unearthly radiance, and to me it would seem that the garden of the hermitage was a veritable Garden of Eden. So really in this talk I want to explore that little tiny passage from Facing Mount Kanchenjunga. And that comes down to an exploration of three themes, which I'll indicate as I go through. So firstly, I want to talk about the Dharma as poetry. So Bhante talks about stanzas of poems appearing unbidden to his mind. Yeah? So I wanted to talk about the Dharma as poetry. For those of you who've read Bhante deeply, it's very obvious, not only in his own writing of poems, but his talking about poems, his reading about poems, that poetry is very, very important to Bhante. So before we go on, remember that the word poems and poetry is being used suggestively and metaphorically. It doesn't mean the great majority of those bits of literature that we call poems. Yeah? It doesn't mean the kind of things I write, marvellous that they are. It doesn't, don't worry folks, I'm not going to read one. It doesn't mean most of what we call poetry. Poetry is a metaphor for something. It's to be used suggestively. I think it's a metaphor for what I'll try and explore. And this aspect of the Dharma as poetry is linked very strongly with the natural world. And we've heard more about this recently in Subhuti and Bhante's paper discussing the imagination and animism in particular. As he walks up these flowering ornamental trees, in that little passage you get this rapturous sense, don't you, of nature. And Bhante in one of the seminars talks about the poetic mood that he sometimes experiences. He says that when he feels in this poetic mood, and I think he even puts it in inverted commas, he says that the barrier between me and the world completely disappears. The barrier, yes, between me and the world completely disappears. He says particularly between me and the natural world, that completely disappears. And then I happen to be reading travel letters, and he talks about this really quite remarkable experience in travel letters where he's had a period where he's been very busy, and then he suddenly experiences this incredible silence. He said it went on for a few days. Complete silence, both internal and external. And the thing with Bhante's writing is that he writes so beautifully and so unegoistically that you move across that as if that's a quite common experience. But I don't think I've ever experienced days and days of internal and external silence. To me, it's a mystical experience. But Bhante doesn't underline it, doesn't highlight it, just sort of goes on to tell you what he thought, what he felt. He even says it's really rather difficult to explain. So he says that out of this silence, internal and external, a silence which is the silence of nisprapuncture, of no prapuncture, of no mental rumination, no mental chatter, out of this kind of silence, he said a rhythm started to emerge. And he's called it a rhythm or a wordless poem, blending with whatever he saw. And he said it was this rhythm arose in him, and it arose in nature at the same time. There was this rhythm arising from the depths of his internal world and from the depths of the external world. And he said, in fact, the whole world was a poem. But at first, he said there was no words to this poem. There was just this rhythm, and the rhythm in his mind, he says, would just blend with looking at... He's just walking around the grounds here of Padmaloka, would just blend with looking at the trees, with looking at the new flowers coming up. Eventually they become some poems. He says that some of them were snatches of poems, some of them were just 2 lines, some of them eventually was a whole sequence. And he makes the point in the letters that this isn't saying anything about the value of the poems themselves. And I think this is important, that when we think about the Dharma of poetry, we're not thinking about literal poems, even Bhante's poems. What Bhante's trying to get at, what he's trying to communicate, is a certain kind of mood, which we could call a kind of poetic mood. It doesn't mean to say we'll ever write a poem, and many of us shouldn't if we can possibly help it. Or if we do, we should be compassionate enough not to read them to people. He says that the whole world becomes a poem. And then in another place in the seminar, he says that the Dharma is to be read poetically. And he said this in lots of different ways at lots of different times. And I still don't really feel sometimes that we've got what he means by that. We mix it up with poetry, and as the American modernist poet Marianne Moore said, poetry, I too dislike it. So for many of us, it's just a bit of a put-off. You just think poetry and you think, I too dislike it. Yeah? So we mix it up with poems, whether the ones we've read or not. But what he's saying is that poetry, like the Dharma, moves on by using factual statements, but the meaning of the poem is not to be found in the factual statements. Yeah? So just like a poem, that it uses descriptions, it uses this happened, that happened, but the meaning is not to be found in them. So the Dharma is just like that it's made up of factual statements, but the meaning of those statements is not to be found in the simple factual statements. So I thought, let's do an example. So I'll read you a poem. Don't worry, folks, it's not very long. It's one of my favourite poets, Robert Frost, which I've read many times before. I like to read this poem because I think it's got particular relevance to order members. And I'll leave you to work out why. So it's called The Road Not Taken. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveller. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth, then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the greater claim because it was grassy and wanted wear, although as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same, and both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh sometime ages and ages hence. Two woods, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. So that's a poem, and I think it's a poem worthy of the name. And what you try to have is that feeling it leaves you with. It echoes beyond itself. If it's read well, and I tried my best, if it's read well, if it's read deeply, if it's read in the best state of mind, it echoes beyond itself. But you could say, but hang on, when was this walk you went on? Why are you telling me about it? So do you like walking? Is that you're interested in walking? And you could say, hang on, are you following the country code? Is this a marked footpath? Because if it's not a marked footpath, it's not very good because you're disturbing the light. If you were even studied the poem, you could find that there are actual contradictions within the poem. So that Frost wants to say the paths are different and at the same time the same. And he just gets away with it. So he says, I want to choose that one because it's better. And then actually it's just about the same. But it can only be one. So you could have all kinds of arguments with him. But none of that's of real relevance. The real importance of the poem is the echo beyond itself that it leaves. The key word really is all, and that has made all the difference. If he said, and that has made the difference, which wouldn't have been metrical, but it wouldn't have worked. The key word is all. That has made all the difference. Yeah? And if you know Frost's biography, you'll know the tragedy of much of his life. That has made all the difference, has got an also rather tragic sense. But it doesn't need to have that. It can have all kinds of resonances. And that's the whole point of the poem. It resonates beyond itself, beyond the words that it uses, beyond the factual statements, into something that you either get or you don't get. If you don't get it, you haven't read the poem. Yeah? And that's exactly like that with the Dharma. It resonates beyond the factual statements it's making into this worldless realm, and you need to get that. You need to catch that resonance. If you don't, you're not really reading the Dharma. This must be one of the reasons why Bhante is so nervous of Buddhist studies, because very easily you don't actually get resonance. You just focus on, but hang on, are these two roads different or the same? Hang on, he's got this from Yeats or wherever it is. Yeah. which really is completely missing the point. And that's obviously much more worrying in the Dharma. Bhante says that really that poetry is the only genuine, legitimate language, because it's only poetry at its best, at its highest, can resonate beyond words. So it's the only legitimate language, because life itself is incommensurable with thought, is incommensurable with words. So poetry is the only legitimate language in this heightened sense. So that's the first thing I wanted to draw out. But the Dharma as poetry, coming from Bhante saying that stanzas of poems appeared unbidden to my mind. Yeah? Then secondly, the Dharma as a communication of right view. So I get this from Bhante's in Facing Mount Kajangunga talking about sentences for articles appeared unbidden to my mind. Yeah? So not just stanzas of poems in one, so he's not a poet. Some people have started to say that Bhante is a poet and Subhuti is a philosopher. Somebody told me that. And I think that isn't fair to either of them. I think both of them are more than that. That's another way of pigeonholing. So Bhante is saying poems appeared unbidden to my mind, and so did sentences for articles in the same mind. Yeah. So for me, this brings me to Bhante's lifelong commitment to the communication of right view, to communicating right view as clearly as possible for the welfare of the world. Yeah. That's why he wants to communicate right view. And this dimension of right view is fundamental if we're to experience the Dharma as poetry. We can't read the Dharma as poetry unless we're grounded in right view. And right view is not something we get, it's something we keep on having to re-establish. It's something we have to keep on nurturing. But only when we're established in right view can we experience the Dharma as poetry in this heightened sense, in this metaphorical sense, not necessarily in this literal sense. So, obviously, I'm drawing some of this from revering and relying on the Dharma and reimagining the Buddha, which I think of as being a diptych, of really remarkable work that you need to see together. You need the both. I really need to read one, then the other, one, then the other, clarifying right view, and that liberates us to the poetry of awakening. So this whole point of clarifying right view, of thinking deeply, of keeping a dharmic perspective, of fostering and clarifying right view, frees us from the canker of literalism. If you look at the seminars, Bhante warns us about literalism again and again and again. He keeps talking about literalism. So if he sees that that's a real issue for us, I think often we don't see how much of an issue that is. It frees us from literalism and liberates us into the endless suggestiveness of the Dharma. Each teaching, each observation, each experience then becomes free to resonate out into how things are, which is wordless, conceptless, thoughtless. But it'll only resonate out to the degree to which your thinking is founded on right view. If we're not doing that, without right view, we'll cling, as we all know, to erroneous concepts. We'll fall prey to fashionable ideologies and methods and theories. We'll do all the things that we get caught up in. I think a lot of our getting caught up, our tripping ourselves up, is because we're still not founded enough in right view. And I feel that's very much myself, because on the retreat I was studying much more, and I felt myself to be much more secured in right view, and how much happier and freer that made me. But when I come back to my life in London, one of the first things to go is not meditation, it's not ethics, it's not friendship, but it's study. It's one of the first things I let go of, as if, oh, well, that's all right, it doesn't matter about that. And yet on the retreat, it was my study that gave me the quickest, most direct access to the poetry of awakening. So I'm talking to myself as much as you, and Jan of Archer will remind me of this after the talk, knowing him. So we need to sound right view so as to listen to how it echoes beyond right view. But you can't do the second without the first. We need to sound right view so we can listen to the echo beyond right view. But the echo, it's like the echo of a bell, like the reverberation of a bell. But we need to keep sounding right view. But it's not just Bhante's talking about right view, it's not just he's thinking about right view, he's communicating it. Sentences for articles, in other words, things that he wants to tell others. So he's communicating right view. It's so easy, isn't it, for all of us, for spiritual life to become quite notional. We can all think, because under Bhante's tutelage, we can all think at least reasonably well. We can put concepts together, we can stick concepts together and sound really quite impressive when you're teaching newcomers at least. You can talk about shunyata and non-duality even, and so on. You can say all kinds of things, but it's very easy to mistake saying for doing. And that goes very deep indeed and is very subtle indeed. It's not just a sort of crude way that I've rather suggested it there. It can be very, very subtle indeed, I think. It can become part of our self-identity, even part of our status. When it does that, I think one of the signs of that is it becomes less resonant. The Dharma becomes less resonant. You have this awful thing in study groups with order members, I'm afraid, where order members just tell each other what they know they already know, and what they know everybody else knows they already know. It's really, really, frankly, dull, and utterly, it doesn't resonate. It has no resonance beyond itself. It's just sort of teaching in the very small sense of that word. I think when we just end up into just thinking rather than communicating, when we end up mistaking thinking for practicing, our language, one of the things I often notice, our language becomes less aesthetic. One of the first things I notice is people's language becomes less aesthetic, less pleasing, less resonant. Either people talk in terms of jargon because they're only too used to talking in this small world of our own. I've recently got involved a little bit in the poetry world, and that's another tiny world. It's actually even smaller than ours, and actually even more disputatious than ours, to be honest. But they often just end up talking to each other, and you end up with this sort of terrible jargon. I think it is what happens in small worlds. Yeah. So it either becomes more jargon-based and platitudinous, or more technical. There's this sort of instinct to make the Dharma more and more technical, which in my experience is always less aesthetic. And the aesthetic is to do with this resonance beyond itself, this poetry of awakening, as I wanted to call it. So, of course, the real test, as we all know, is how right view is actually lived out in our life, how we live our life, the practical, particularly ethical life we live. We all know that wrong views are based on negative emotions. But what strikes me is Bhante is trying to communicate. And if you really try and communicate, you have to take into account the other person. You have to find ways of helping them understand, not just tell them the sort of things you like to say, not to draw out your little aphorism again, not to say the sort of things you say, but actually try to talk to them, find how they are going to catch the Dharma. Bhante, all of his life, has been devoted to, committed to, communicating right view for the welfare of the world. And we need to join in that. We are joining in that, but that is of vital importance to liberate us into the poetry of awakening. I was struck here again reading one of the seminars where, at the end, it's a women's seminar on the wisdom section of Three Jewels. The last 10 pages are really wonderful to read. Bhante just takes off. Sometimes in the seminars, Bhante's in this very relaxed mood where he just talks about his experience in a very relaxed and buttoned way. And he's talking about reading the Dharma. He said, I've always read the Dharma, I've always understood it. It's always felt very, very familiar to me. He said, I immediately get very, very absorbed indeed. And it's always been a relief to read the Dharma. He said, some other reading I found more difficult. But when I read the Dharma, I just understand it. It's a relief. It's like coming home. And even he says it might be, I think it's a past life thing. It just feels very, very familiar. I know where I am. It's a relief. Yeah? And he says he doesn't make much distinction between reading the Dharma and meditating. He says, well, they're both bases for insight. And when I read the Dharma, I get very, very deeply indeed, absorbed indeed. And I've seen Bhante read. I remember when I first got ordained First got ordained, I only got ordained once. That's the whole point, isn't it? When I got ordained, I'd be walking past his house and just seeing him on the veranda reading. And, you'd go a long walk and chat, and you'd come back and he'd still be in exactly the same posture reading, just like you might be meditating. So he says, I don't make much of a distinction between reading the Dharma and meditating. They're both bases of insight. And yes, he says that, yes, I've always understood it. Even quite early on, I had to explain it to my teachers. Sometimes my teachers weren't really clear what was being said, and I had to explain it. It's a remarkable piece to read. Suddenly Bhante just sort of starts, oh yes, I think it's probably my past life, and then, anyway, I think it's time for tea. Yeah. So last point on this second section of my talk, I was also struck by Bhante talking about doctrinal differences. This is in the Nature of Reality seminar. He says he was really struck when he first got back to England about how, in the Buddhist society, how many doctrinal differences there were between people, and how harshly people communicated them, and how entrenched they were in their own position, and that sometimes it was even tiny bits within a particular tradition. So it was this aspect of the tradition that was fighting with that aspect of the very same tradition. And Bhante was really struck by that. And he was saying, well, as long as there's enough living together, working together, practicing together, you don't need to worry too much about doctrinal differences. He said it doesn't matter if Nagabodhi is particularly inspired by this and Subhuti is particularly inspired by that. That's all right, because we're all living together, we're practicing together, we're doing the same meditations, the same puja. All that doesn't really matter. He said it only comes to matter when there isn't that shared practice, that doctrinal differences become more and more important when there isn't a shared life, particularly a shared living life of waking up with each other, having breakfast, meditating together, studying together, talking together, being friends together. And I must say, reading that seminar really resonates into now, doesn't it? How suddenly doctrinal differences between us are sharpening sometimes, and hopefully that little phase is over now, I think. But perhaps it's to do with the fact that we aren't living together so much. We're not sharing our lives together so much. I don't think personally that retreats are enough. We do need our communities. We do even need our team-based right livelihood businesses. We really need to be living and practicing together. And it's interesting that as that central plank of our movement and order, I can't think of a metaphor, slightly rotted, slightly bent, slightly warped, is a bit fragile, doctrinal differences have grown, haven't they? Really grown exponentially in that time. As so often when you read Bhante's in seminar, you keep seeing him predicting the future. Things that are happening now, he's already talked about then. But it really struck me that so many people aren't living communally, and if they don't want to, of course, that's fine. I'm not trying to do that old thing. Please don't misunderstand me. But whilst all of those central institutions have suffered a falling away, at least to some degree, in some ways quite a degree, doctrinal differences have suddenly sharpened, people have taken them up much more vociferously, and so on. Yeah? Okay, so the third part of my talk, and this is I wanted to talk about the Dharma as mystery. And in a way, this was the main thing I wanted to really emphasise, was the Dharma as mystery. I wanted to try and put some flesh on that. And it comes from the part of the reading that I read at the start, from Facing Mount Kanchenjunga, where Bhante says that feelings and insights for which as yet I had no words, that these lines from poems would appear. So I wanted to talk about the Dharma as poetry. Sentences for articles appeared unbidden, which is a communication of right view. But also feelings and insights for which as yet I had no words. And these feelings and insight left me with a feeling of intense joy, he says, so that the flowers above my head would shine with an unearthly radiance. So this is the Dharma as mystery. I was really struck by feelings and insights for which as yet I had no words. Very, very important statement, for which as yet I had no words. So Bhante is not thinking, hang on, what does this... As he can have those feelings and insights, but he's not worried yet, as yet I have no words. Yeah? Very, very important little sub-part of that sentence. So as I said, that the function of right view and of Bhante's emphasis on clear thinking is to liberate the poetry of awakening, or to use our more current language, to release the imagination, especially the ascending imagination. So I want to try and explore a little bit more about what we mean by Dharma as mystery. And all I can do is talk a bit from my own experience of that. And it's primarily an experience, just recently, of being at Gukilokha, wanting to feel very close to Bhante. The reason why I decided to study Bhante was partly to prevent myself from writing poems and from reading poems, something that Jan of Arch would agree to very much indeed, and to be close to Bhante on that important time when I was helping be on the team to see men ordained. And what struck me most forcibly rereading Bhante, it's not that I haven't been reading between times, I have been, but rereading in a better mental state, with a less cluttered mind, with a clearer sense of right view. What struck me most forcibly is that Bhante knows the Dharma from the other side. And I felt that everywhere I touched Bhante, whether it was a letter, whether it was the memoir, whether it was a seminar, whether it was a lecture he gave about literature East and West, which I reread, whether it was so many different things that Bhante has talked about, I always felt that Bhante knows the Dharma from the other side. Not just words out to their wordless resonance, not just words out from their wordless to their wordless resonance, but resonance back into words, if you see what I mean. That Bhante knows the resonance and can translate the resonance back into words, if you see what I mean. We have words. Luckily, we have Bhante's incredibly resonant words. But we have words, we have images, we have teachings. We have all kinds of books, and we have to feel the resonance. We have to feel the poetry of awakening. To do that, we need right view, to be liberated into the poetry of awakening. Bhante, I think, feels the resonance and finds ways of communicating it, finds ways of bringing it into words. So I was rereading the wonderful talk he gave called The Journey to Il Convento. If you haven't read it or reread it recently, do read that and do reread St. Jerome Revisited. And they're remarkable lectures. Lectures not quite the word for them. They're really kind of inspired asides. So much of Bhante's seminars particularly seem to me to be a sequence of inspired asides. But he talks about St. Jerome being engaged with the work of translation, especially that of rendering the word of God into ordinary human speech. And I was really struck by that, especially that of rendering the words of God into ordinary human speech. And without being misunderstood, folks, I sort of feel that there's something of Bhante about that. Rendering the words of God, in this case the Buddha that didn't create the universe, the God that didn't create the universe, into ordinary human speech. That Bhante is in touch, I won't say with God, just to be clear from the video, as Bhante says, ironically, the God that didn't create the universe, but the Buddha. He'd have a direct contact with him, it seems to me, and he can render it into ordinary human speech. I was really struck by that, and this feeling that Bhante is in touch, even guided by mystery. And that it's not just mystery about the Dharma, but it's a mystery about all human experience. It is a mystery of all human experience. That the world is mystery, even that the world is Dharma. I was obviously studying Shantideva and the Dharma in the singing of the birds, in the whispering of the trees, in the dancing sunbeams. That's Shantideva saying that life is the Dharma. Life is that kind of mystery. And I really felt Bhante's resonance with that, his somehow being in that, being in touch with that, whether, as I say, whether he's ordering a pizza in Florence or whatever he's doing. Yeah? I was particularly struck by this. I was reading one of Bhante's lectures outside and just rereading one of the lectures, and those moments, a little bit like when you read poems, very like when you read poems, and you stop reading the poem and you look up and the barrier between you and the natural world has fallen away. Just like poems, when you know that something's a poem because of what it does to life, suddenly there's more life. I felt that exactly that studying Bhante at times. I'd just look up from my little hut in Kukuloka, and the very fabric of life, which is really what I can see in front of me, which is this thing we've got here and now, was intrinsically meaningful, intrinsically mysterious, intrinsically wonderful, wordless, and that reading Bhante, studying Bhante, had released me into that, just as reading great poets can, at their very best, do that. So this is what I mean by the sense of Bhante knowing the Dharma from the other side. He's relating to that kind of experience of resonance, as I'm wanting to call it. And of course, to know the Dharma is to know the Buddha. And we were doing the Buddhana Smrti practice, and I was very struck by the Buddhana Smrti practice there. I really enjoyed it. It's not quite the right word. I really valued it. Satyaraja read it really very wonderfully. And as I was trying to evoke the presence of the Buddha, it suddenly occurred to me, Bhante knows the Buddha. So suddenly there was my imagination, but then there was Bhante's imagination. And the great beam of his imagination and my little beam intersected, and I could see the Buddha, as it were. There was the Buddha. It was like when you know somebody who knows and loves somebody very well that you've never met, and they talk about that person, and you begin to know and love that person as well, even though you've never met them. And when you do meet them, you're really, really pleased to meet them. You're already open to them. You already know them. And I felt that very much in the Buddhana Smrti, that I knew the Buddha because Bhante knew the Buddha so well. I mean, the reason Bhante knows the Buddha is because Bhante knows the Dharma. The reason Bhante knows the Dharma is because he knows the resonance of the Dharma and then can translate it back into words and knows what the words mean in terms of resonance, in terms of the poetry of awakening. And it's in this sense, isn't it, that the Dharma is caught, not taught. We need to catch this mystery from Bhante and from others who are in touch with that. You can never reduce that mystery to practices, teachings, attitudes. You just can't. It's a mystery. You need to be in touch with it. You need to catch it. Which, of course, makes me think of how mental states, attitudes, and behaviours are extremely infectious. Everything we do is extremely infectious. There's even been studies to show that if you're happy, your happiness affects two people away from you. So it affects the people that you're in contact with, but it affects another person away from that you're not in contact with. That it's infectious in that sense. Yeah? So we need to catch the infection of mystery, to catch the infection of the poetry of awakening. That means being liberated from literalism, and that means studying right view. We need, in other words, to activate our imaginal faculty, our imagination. And I want to try to emphasize that imagination, in a sense, is nothing to do with art. In a way, it would be better not to think of it as anything to do with art, or at least not especially to do with art, not anything to do with poetry, not anything at all to do with being creative. All these words have lost their potency. If you are an artist or a poet, you don't need any encouragement from me to do it. In fact, if you're like me, you'll need a bit of encouragement not to do it. So at the moment, I don't want imagination to include the arts, I'm afraid. And you know what I'm like. It's nothing to do with poetry in the way that we tend to think of it. In a way, imagination is nothing to do with you. You can't decide to be imaginative. It's not a decision you can make. You can create the conditions out of which imagination arises, but you yourself cannot be imaginative. If you try to be, it's usually fancy. I think for some of us, sometimes art and the arts can just become part of a sort of extension of our personal style. A bit like people who are into surfing. You know, they like wearing, you can wear surfy clothes, can't you? Go to surfy cafes. I'm not particularly into it myself, although I have friends. I'd like to be, frankly. I'd rather be into surfing than, anyway. than poetry, but I'd probably be much better looking. But just as you can have a whole world of being a surfer, irrespective of whether you actually surf very much. Art and poetry and all those kind of things can just become extensions of your personal style, which has nothing to do with the imagination at all. Yeah? So let's sort of liberate it a bit from the imagination if we can. In a sense, you are never imaginative. The moment of imagination is always a moment beyond you. And whether that's in meditation, whether that's in your council meeting, whether that's in your community, whether that's at home, the moment of genuine imagination is always a moment beyond you. You cannot do it. Yes, you can create the conditions, of course, but you can't do it. Subhuti and Bhante both emphasize again and again that imagination is a synthesis of reason and emotion. And I think sometimes we lose the reason bit of it. So we think that imagination is a synthesis of emotion and emotion, or emotion and images. We often lose the reason. Yeah? I was struck when I was thinking about this of Schopenhauer, and he said that philosophy is doing in abstracto what art is doing in concreto. So in other words, philosophy tries to tell and art tries to show. That's what Schopenhauer is trying to say, that art is doing in concreto what philosophy is doing in abstracto. A real work of art is as tough as any philosophical argument translated into imagination. It has that kind of rigour. It's not a floppy, soppy emotional thing. It has that kind of rigour, even emotional rigour. So if you look at Cézanne, for instance, Cézanne's paintings are a working out in concreto of Schopenhauer's concern about what is the nature of perception. Cézanne actually read Schopenhauer very deeply. He's actually one of the best, he's the best read of all the Impressionists. And in his painting of those trees in France, he was trying to explore the issue of what am I perceiving? What is actually perceived here? And based on his reading of Schopenhauer. So it's trying to show that rather than tell it. Yeah? Schopenhauer thought that Shakespeare was the greatest mind outside of philosophy. He said he showed the nature of things, just as Kant told you the nature of things. He thought that Kant was the greatest mind inside philosophy. So, whatever the mystery of the Dharma is that Bhante talks about in this moment where he has feelings and insights for which I had no words, the key must be in this emotional equivalence to our intellectual understandings. It's something that we all know, that aphorism, but it strikes me as being one of the great pith teachings of our great teacher, the finding emotional equivalence to our intellectual understanding. That's where the mystery lies. That's where the poetry of awakening lies. In some profound sense, the mystery of the Dharma is an emotional one. Bhante even says in the seminar that he thinks that the word wisdom isn't very good, doesn't really do it. He even says that the word prajna doesn't really do it. They all suggest something too intellectual. They all suggest something to do too much with thinking. And he says, no, it's not really like that. It's much more that all of your emotions are behind your understanding. All that your emotions that are normally going into the things that are taking you away from the Dharma are actually taking you into the Dharma. He said it's much more like that, and that the word wisdom or the word prajna doesn't really communicate that, doesn't really taste of that. Yeah? He says that wisdom is an emotional matter and a clarifying of that. So whatever the mystery of the Dharma is, it's to be found in this emotional equivalence. It's to be found in the resonance of words. It's to be explored in that way. So I just want to conclude, which is what I've hoped to be a sort of close reading of a very short passage from Facing Mount Kanchenjunga. And it's Bhante just walking up and down this little path between the hermitage and the shrine. And as I say, there's this sense I had, reading the memoirs, that Bhante's just doing one thing. And that one thing is too big to talk about, too big to write about. You can never directly talk about it or say about it. You have to break it down into things. But actually it's just one thing that Bhante's doing. It includes meditation, it includes study, it includes everything. And I've tried to break that down, though, into saying, well, first of all, there's the Dharma as poetry, because poetry, in this heightened sense, in this metaphorical sense, echoes beyond words, and that life is incommensurable with thought. So that poetry is the only legitimate speech, that our speech needs to tend to poetry in the sense of it resonates beyond itself, not in the sense of it just uses lots and lots of images or sounds poetic, which is often not poetry at all, it's just fancy. Secondly, that sentences, and that comes from, stanzas came unbidden to my mind. Sentences for articles came unbidden to my mind. So we need to devote ourselves to communicating right view, the fundamental importance of right view, so as to liberate ourselves to the poetry of awakening. And then feelings and insights as for which as yet I had no words. The Dharma as mystery, perceived only by the ascending imagination, by Shraddha, a Dharma to be caught and not taught, and that's going to be primarily an emotional matter, in the sense of having clarified and keep clarifying right view, we find emotional equivalents to our intellectual understandings. After all, it's easy to find emotional equivalents to the wrong intellectual understandings. Do you see what I mean? It's not, Bhante in that aphorism isn't saying, he's saying the intellectual understandings have to be right, and then you find emotional equivalents to them. We need to keep on getting those understandings righter, to use a sort of childlike word, and find deeper and deeper emotional equivalents to them, to right view, the echoing out of right view. And then when I thought about this more, I thought, well, this is our great triad, isn't it? These three little statements hidden in this volume of memoirs, which Bhante doesn't particularly emphasize, which Bhante doesn't highlight, he doesn't say anything about those experiences. But what they seem to me is that great triad of beauty, truth, and goodness. So we have the poetry of awakening, we have the Dharma as poetry, and that is beauty, and everything that Bhante's taught about beauty. We have the communication of right view for the welfare of the world, and that is goodness. That's why we communicate right view, to help people liberate themselves into the poetry of awakening. So that is goodness. And then we have these feelings and insights for which as yet I had no words, and that is truth. And truth is mystery. And if I'd had time, what I wanted to do, I wanted to draw out people in our order, men and women in our order, who I think particularly exemplify one of those qualities, but which all those qualities are there. So I was thinking of Subhuti's truth, and I mean truth in this sense of mystery and imagination. But I also know truth, Subhuti's grasp of beauty and Subhuti's grasp of goodness. He's a very, very good man. And I wanted to reiterate those many, many times, but I don't have time. It seems to me that from this little part of Facing Man Kanchenjunga, we can just think about beauty, truth and goodness all over again. We can reimagine the Dharma in those ways all over again. So what started in this talk as being, in my mind, as being an exploration of the Dharma, trying to understand the Dharma, trying to explore the Dharma, becomes a rejoicing in Bhante, our teacher. And I didn't mean it to be. I didn't set off for it to be. I was just going to start with this passage, but it felt when I finished writing my little notes for it that it was a rejoicing in Bhante. And that's because the Dharma is a living thing. It's not a set of words. It's not a few books. It's a living thing. And by living thing, we mean living person who embodies that to a great, very great degree. And then, if you remember, all of this is me trying to say that Bhante is doing one thing, and that we're trying to do one thing. So that even to break them down into poetry as beauty, as truth as mystery, and goodness as a communication of right view for the welfare of all, still doesn't quite do it. Put together, they become uninterrupted creativity. In the end of the seminar on the nature of existence, Bhante talks about uninterrupted creativity, that it would be better to think that we're just moving towards uninterrupted creativity. And again, I don't want to particularly mean the arts here, I mean uninterrupted creativity of self. And this to me then showed me again why Avalokiteshvara, the thousand-armed Avalokiteshvara is our image for the order. All those arms are an image for uninterrupted creativity. Always being on the ball, always being emotionally positive, always being creative, always finding a deeper response, a stronger resonance, always active, always trying to help the world, all those 1,000 arms. But that at his heart, Avalokiteshvara holds the jewel of mystery to his heart, which is life itself. Thank you very much.